It was a day like any other in the bustling streets of New York. People moved through the upscale boutiques with the sort of ease only the city's elite could know. But inside one of the most exclusive stores, something unexpected was about to happen. Something that would leave a lasting mark on everyone involved. Melania Trump, dressed in elegant simplicity, stepped into the boutique. A woman whose every movement captured attention, whose every outfit made headlines. She wasn't looking for the spotlight that day, though. She was simply there to browse, to enjoy a rare moment of peace. But as she glided through the door, the energy in the room shifted. The boutique manager, standing behind the counter, eyed her with a sense of superiority that only a few could afford. When he noticed her, the smirk on his face said it all. To him, she was just another customer. No, not even that. She was someone beneath him, someone who didn't belong in his world of exclusivity. He approached her with a coldness in his tone, dismissing her with a few sharp words. He told her the store was too busy for someone like her to be browsing. The insinuation was clear. People like her weren't welcome here. And just like that, Melania Trump, the former First Lady of the United States, was humiliated in the one place she least expected it. No cameras, no media frenzy. Just a woman, humiliated in silence, yet maintaining the poise and grace that had always defined her. She stood there for a moment, processing the sting of his words, and then, without a word, turned and walked out. The door closed behind her, and the manager returned to his desk, oblivious to the storm he had just set into motion. What he didn't know was that Melania's return wasn't going to be what anyone expected. Absolutely. Here is section 1. Written with emotional depth and maintaining the flow from the previous section. The city's heartbeat pulsed in the distance, but inside that boutique, it felt like time had stopped. The luxurious surroundings, gleaming marble floors, polished glass shelves filled with the finest couture, seemed to fade away in an instant. Everything was drowned out by the sharp, cutting words that hung heavy in the air. Melania Trump had walked in like she always did, effortlessly graceful, with an elegance that could only come from someone who had lived most of her life in the spotlight. She wasn't seeking attention. She was simply taking a rare moment to herself, a brief escape from the constant glare of the world. The shop, however, had no idea who it was dealing with. The boutique manager, perched high behind his sleek counter, scanned the room with an air of superiority that was hard to miss. He had seen his fair share of customers, but Melania, well, she was just another woman in his eyes. Another potential sale, nothing more. He had no idea the weight of the presence he had just dismissed. When he saw her, an arrogant glint flashed across his face. There was something in his gaze that spoke volumes. He was too caught up in his own little world to see beyond the surface. In that moment, he decided, almost instinctively, that she didn't fit in. She didn't belong in his perfect, curated world. His tone dripped with condescension as he approached her, dismissing her without a second thought. "You'll have to leave," he said curtly, his voice oozing with entitlement. "We're too busy for people like you." For a second, the words didn't quite land. Melania, so used to facing criticism, so accustomed to handling the harshest of judgments, stood there for a moment. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She didn't cause a scene. Instead, she stood with a quiet dignity that was both powerful and painful to witness. The words stung, but she wouldn't show it. She knew what to do in moments like this. Remain calm, composed, and walk away. With grace, she turned on her heel, her movements fluid and deliberate. The quiet click of her heels was the only sound in the store as she made her way toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The world had just witnessed a moment of injustice, but no one seemed to notice. No one but the manager, who watched her exit, still unaware of the disaster he had just unleashed. As the door closed behind her, he returned to his post, perhaps thinking it was just another minor inconvenience. A celebrity tantrum, a momentary disturbance in his otherwise perfect day. But he couldn't have been more wrong. Because the truth was, Melania Trump wasn't the kind of person who would let something like this slide. And what happened next would shock everyone in the store. Sure. Here's section 3 written with emotional depth and connected to the previous section. The boutique manager watched as the door clicked shut behind Melania, a quiet, almost dismissive sound. He went back to his desk, muttering under his breath, completely unaware of the storm brewing. He was already moving on to the next customer as though nothing had happened, as though Melania Trump's dignified exit had meant nothing. But deep down, something in his gut twisted. He didn't know it yet, but that small moment, his rude, arrogant dismissal, was about to come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't have imagined. Hours passed, and the day dragged on. The manager continued with his work, feeling a strange sense of confidence that nothing major would come from his interaction with Melania. After all, what could a woman like her really do? She was just another rich person, another celebrity who had been refused service. He'd seen plenty of people like her, and he was sure she'd move on, as most did. But when the evening news broke, the world found out. The boutique manager's careless actions were broadcasted everywhere. News outlets picked up the story, the headline flashing across screens: "Luxury Boutique Refuses Service to Melania Trump." It didn't take long for the firestorm to begin. Social media exploded with outrage, people questioning how someone could treat a former first lady, an icon of grace and dignity, with such disdain. By the time the manager checked his phone later that evening, his heart dropped. Notifications flooded in, and the reality of what he'd done hit him like a freight train. His face went pale as he scrolled through the posts, seeing the angry reactions pouring in from all corners of the internet. But there was something deeper, something he hadn't expected, buried within the flurry of comments. Among the noise, there were whispers, people speculating, questioning what had really happened. Was this an act of classism? Was the manager's arrogance the result of something more insidious? And then, the most powerful thought that gnawed at his conscience. Was this mistake bigger than he realized? As the hours passed, guilt began to take hold. The manager replayed the moment over and over in his mind, wishing he could take back the words, wishing he could undo the damage. He hadn't realized it before, but the truth was clear now. He had made a grave error. He had underestimated Melania, her poise, her ability to remain calm in the face of humiliation. And more importantly, he had completely misunderstood her character. Melania Trump wasn't just any woman walking into a store. She was someone who carried herself with dignity, who didn't need to raise her voice to command attention or respect. She was someone who could rise above petty insults, someone who could turn a humiliating experience into an opportunity for something greater. As the days wore on, the manager's regret grew heavier. He couldn't escape the shame, the humiliation of realizing how wrong he had been. And then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, he received a call that made his heart race. Melania Trump was coming back. But this time, things would be different. This time, the boutique manager would face the consequences of his actions, and nothing would ever be the same again. Absolutely. Here's section 4, written with emotional depth and maintaining the flow of the story. The boutique manager sat in his office, eyes glued to his phone, unable to escape the growing storm surrounding him. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization sank in. He had made a massive mistake. His arrogance had blinded him to the reality of the situation. And now, as the anger from the public continued to pour in, he couldn't shake the feeling that his career might be over. How could he have been so blind, so careless? What was he thinking when he turned Melania Trump away? His thoughts swirled with guilt and regret. The more he replayed the scene in his mind, the more he understood the depth of his error. He had humiliated someone who, despite her public persona, had every right to be treated with the utmost respect. He hadn't just insulted Melania. He had insulted her dignity, her grace, and perhaps worse, he had insulted the very idea of kindness and humility. And now, the backlash was unforgiving. The manager knew he couldn't undo what had been done, but he also knew that there was one thing he could do: make amends. His stomach churned as he thought about it. Would Melania accept his apology? Would she even listen? He was no fool. He knew that the chances of winning her forgiveness were slim. But he had to try. He had no other choice. With a deep breath, he called the boutique's owner, his voice shaking as he explained the situation. "I need to do something. I need to apologize to her to make this right, he said, his voice tight with shame. The owner, though initially silent, eventually agreed to support him. But there was no hiding the reality. This wasn't just about him anymore. The store's reputation was on the line. The entire luxury brand could be tarnished by his actions. But that didn't matter to the manager. What mattered now was facing Melania. He had to confront the woman whose dignity he had crushed, whose name he had dragged through the mud. He couldn't escape his responsibility. The next morning, he made his move. As he arrived at the boutique, his mind raced. He had no idea what to expect. Would she show up? Would she even want to talk to him? The minutes felt like hours as he anxiously awaited any sign of her. Then, just as he was about to give up, the door opened, and there she was, Melania Trump. But this time, she wasn't alone. She entered the store with an air of quiet confidence. And though she appeared calm on the outside, the manager could sense the weight of her presence. She was here not just as a former first lady, but as someone who had been wronged, someone who now had the power to decide his fate. For a moment, the manager couldn't move. His heart was racing, his hands clammy, but he knew that he had to act. He stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I owe you an apology," he said, his words heavy with remorse. "What I did was unforgivable, and I am truly sorry." Melania looked at him for a long, painful moment. He braced himself for rejection, for the cold silence that he deserved. But what came next shocked him to his core. She didn't lash out. She didn't demand anything from him. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. And in that quiet moment, the manager realized something. This wasn't just about apologizing for a mistake. It was about confronting the truth and, perhaps, changing the course of his life forever. Absolutely. Here's section 5, keeping the emotional tone and connecting it seamlessly to the previous part. The boutique manager stood frozen in the middle of the store, his heart pounding in his chest. Melania's steady gaze never wavered, and for the first time, he felt truly small. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, as he waited for her to speak, to acknowledge the apology he had so desperately offered. But she didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, her presence filling the room with an unspoken weight. His mind raced. Was she silently rejecting him? Was this her way of showing him how insignificant he had made her feel? But then, something happened that he hadn't expected. Melania broke the silence, her voice calm and even, yet with a clarity that hit him like a thunderclap. "I don't need your apology," she said, her words measured but powerful. "You've already done enough to show me who you are." The manager's heart dropped. What was she saying? Was she dismissing him? But before he could speak, she continued, her words ringing in the air like a judgment he couldn't escape. "But you, on the other hand, need to learn something," she said, her eyes locking with his. "It's not about apologizing. It's about recognizing the power of humility." In that moment, the boutique manager understood. Melania wasn't here to exact revenge or make him feel like a fool. She was here to teach him something far greater. The lesson wasn't just about his mistake. It was about something deeper, something that had eluded him his entire life. The power of treating people with respect, no matter their status. The manager, for the first time, felt the weight of his arrogance. He had looked at Melania as if she were just another customer, someone beneath him, someone whose dignity didn't matter. But in that instant, it became clear to him that Melania Trump, in all her grace and power, had been trying to show him something that transcended the incident itself. She had chosen to be the bigger person, to rise above his cruelty. And in doing so, she had left him with a lesson that would change his life forever. The air felt heavy as she stepped toward him. "I won't hold this against you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you will remember this day. You will remember the moment you thought you could dismiss someone based on your own arrogance. And hopefully, you will never forget the power of kindness." For a long moment, the manager didn't know what to say. The words that had been swirling in his mind suddenly felt insignificant. How could he possibly explain the depth of his regret? How could he ever make up for what he had done? But as Melania turned to leave, he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. Her grace wasn't just about how she handled the situation. It was about how she had chosen to handle it without anger or resentment. She had made the choice to rise above the ugliness of the world and walk away, teaching him in the process that true strength lies not in how loud you can shout, but in how calmly you can carry yourself in the face of injustice. And as she stepped out of the boutique, the manager felt something stir inside him, something he couldn't ignore. He had been given a second chance, not just to redeem himself, but to grow. And he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he would never make the same mistake again. Sure. Here's section 6, continuing the emotional journey and maintaining the flow from the previous section. As the boutique door clicked shut behind Melania, the manager stood in stunned silence, her words echoing in his mind. They were simple, but they struck deep, unraveling something inside him that he hadn't even realized needed to be undone. "You will remember this day," she had said, and as the minutes passed, he began to understand the full weight of her statement. He looked around the boutique, the luxury items lining the shelves, the pristine decor that seemed so cold and perfect. Everything suddenly felt hollow, superficial. He had built his life around exclusivity, around wealth and power, but Melania had shown him the one thing money couldn't buy: dignity. In that moment, he realized how little he truly understood about the human connections that meant something. The empty transactions he'd spent his life managing, those were nothing compared to the raw humanity Melania had just displayed. His heart sank as the gravity of the situation pressed on him. Melania Trump had walked away, leaving him with a lesson far more valuable than any expensive suit or priceless piece of jewelry in his boutique. She had given him the chance to see himself through her eyes, and the reflection wasn't pretty. He had allowed his own arrogance to dictate his actions, dismissing someone simply because he believed she was beneath him. And yet, Melania's reaction, her calm, collected grace, had left him speechless. She had turned his ignorance into an opportunity for growth. As the hours ticked by, he thought about how much he had taken for granted. Every day, people entered his boutique hoping to buy their way into a world that seemed so far removed from reality. And yet, in the midst of it all, he had lost sight of what really mattered. Connection, respect, compassion. These were the things that made someone truly rich. Not the numbers in a bank account, not the designer labels on a shelf, but the ability to treat others with kindness, no matter their status or background. The more he thought about Melania's visit, the more he realized that he had a choice. He could continue down the path he had been on, living in the bubble of his own inflated sense of importance, or he could change. The decision wasn't easy. It wasn't going to happen overnight. But it was clear that his life, his way of thinking, needed to shift. And that's when he made a decision. He knew he had to publicly acknowledge his mistake, to not only make amends with Melania, but to show the world that he was willing to learn. The next day, he posted an open letter online. He didn't hide behind an apology that was shallow or insincere. He spoke from the heart. He admitted his wrongdoing. He vowed to never again treat anyone as if they were beneath him. The response was overwhelming. People appreciated his honesty, his willingness to own up to his mistake. But it wasn't just about the apology. It was about the change they saw in him. The boutique manager wasn't just a man who had learned a lesson. He was a man who had evolved. As time passed, he became a symbol of humility in a world that often valued pride. People came to the boutique not only for the luxury items but for the human connection he now offered. He treated every customer, rich or poor, with the same level of respect and dignity, and the boutique became known not just for its high-end products, but for its commitment to kindness. And Melania? She never spoke of that day again. But when she walked into the boutique once more, months later, the manager was ready. He greeted her with a quiet, sincere nod, and she gave him a small, knowing smile. There was no need for words. The lesson had already been learned. Certainly. Here's section 7, continuing the emotional arc and incorporating a call to action. Months passed, and the boutique manager felt a profound shift inside himself. What started as a single humbling encounter had transformed into something much greater. His life no longer revolved around superficial measures of success. Instead, he began to truly connect with the people around him. It wasn't just about the items on the shelves anymore. It was about creating an experience, a relationship with each person who walked through that door. Every customer, no matter their background, was treated with the same respect and warmth he had once reserved only for the elite. The boutique became a sanctuary, a place where kindness and luxury coexisted, where people felt valued for who they were, not just what they could afford. The change wasn't just external. The manager found himself becoming a better person, more patient, more empathetic, more willing to listen and understand. He'd learned the power of humility, of not letting ego define his interactions with others. And while his apology to Melania Trump had been a starting point, the ripple effect had extended far beyond that single moment. One evening, as the store closed and the last customer exited, the manager sat at his desk, reflecting on how far he'd come. He couldn't help but smile as he thought about the days when he'd believed success was measured by money and prestige. Now it was measured by the connections he made, the lives he touched, and the growth he experienced on his journey. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes, the temptation to slip back into old habits surfaced, but he fought it, reminding himself of the lessons he had learned from Melania. And then, as if fate had a way of making sure he never forgot those lessons, the doorbell chimed, and in walked a familiar face, Melania Trump. This time, however, there was no tension, no weighty silence. She walked in, just as graceful and poised as ever, and greeted him with a warm smile. He was ready this time, ready to greet her as an equal, to show her that the man who had once been arrogant and dismissive was gone, replaced by someone who understood the value of humility. They exchanged pleasantries, and it felt as though the space between them had closed completely. No longer was she a symbol of power and distance. She was simply a person who had taught him the most valuable lesson of all. As Melania prepared to leave, she turned to him, offering a few words that, even after everything, still struck him deeply. "I'm proud of the change I've seen in you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Remember that the greatest strength is not in being right. It's in being willing to learn and grow." Those words, simple yet profound, would stay with him for the rest of his life. The boutique manager had learned that life wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but about how you rose from them. Now, as the manager stood at the door, watching Melania walk away for the final time, he knew his journey was far from over. He had learned a lesson, yes, but there would always be more to learn, more room to grow. And it was a journey he was eager to continue. If you've ever experienced a moment of realization, where the truth hits you in a way you never expected, then you know that growth isn't something you can plan for. It happens when you least expect it. It's about being open to change, being willing to confront your mistakes, and embracing the lessons that come with them. If the story resonated with you, share it with others who may need to hear it. Let's all remember the importance of kindness, humility, and growth. And remember, no matter where you are in your journey, it's never too late to start again.